Just look at this. A master at multitasking, she juggled several hockey practices, school board, orchestra, and other extracurricular activities. June 2005 brought terrible news to this mother of three by now president of the Parents' Council at Western Canada College. An emergency surgery revealed metastatic cancer. She refused the cloak of illness. She did not give up on any of her roles. You know, she had all these roles, and they were more important than who she was. She even continued her 5 a.m. bicycle trips around the nearby reservoir. Now imagine that when you're getting chemotherapy. She enrolled in a life coaching course, and upon graduation from the Adler School, she initiated Living Out Loud, a group for women with cancer. That's very typical of people who get chronic disease. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept eating 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. Okay. So that this poor man suffered under the belief that, number one, he was responsible how everybody else felt, and number two, he must never disappoint anybody. So he actually couldn't say to his mother, you know, Mom, I got amazing news. I got 4 kids. And I'm gonna have dinner with them most of the time. Nor could he say to his wife, you know, Rosalind, I'm very close with my mom. She needs my support. So once or twice a week, I'm gonna have dinner with her. He just tried to please everybody all the time. And this need to please everybody all the time, it'll kill you. And for reasons I will tell you. And these reasons are not psychological. They're physiological. They have to do with the body, the immune system, and everything else. You can't separate the mind from the body. And the problem with my profession, the medical profession, is that we make 2 separations that are actually, in life, impossible to make. One is that we separate the mind from the body. We think that people's emotional lives are somehow separate from their physiology. Completely false assumption, unscientific, refuted by all the research, and yet if you go to a doctor, I know some of you here have had autoimmune illnesses, for example. So ask yourself, when you've been to the physician with your rheumatoid arthritis, your joint being inflamed, or some other rheumatic condition, did anybody ever ask you about your childhood? Anybody ever ask you about your stresses in your life? Anybody ever ask you about your marriage? About how you relate to your work? About how you look after yourself or how you don't? Likely not. Likely what they did is they said, you got this illness, we don't know why you got it, and here are the pills. So they'll give you a medication to suppress the inflammation, or they'll give you a medication because autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body itself, so we give you a medication to suppress the immune system itself. Or we'll give you cortisol or some kind of other steroid. Well, that's all we do. We don't talk about the life factors that may have contributed to the onset of the illness. And I can guarantee you that any of you here who've had chronic illness of any kind, you're going to recognize yourself in this talk. Completely and 100%. And you're going to wonder, why didn't anybody say this to me before? Because in the West, when I say the West, I mean the dominant Western culture, unlike Aboriginal cultures, unlike the traditional medicines of China or India or native traditions around the world, we separate the mind from the body. So we treat only the body, unless you have mental illness, in which case we still separate the mind from the body. And the other thing we separate is the individual from the environment. As I said to you last night, those of you that were there, you can't separate people from their environment. People are shaped by the environment. And in lifelong interaction with the environment is how human beings live. Now let me give you 3 examples of that. Why you can't separate people from the environment. It's been shown now, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. Now, not controversial. Several studies have shown that. So in polluted areas where there is more asthma, it's the kids of parents who are stressed who are most likely to have the asthma. Now, most doctors have never heard about that. And if they did, they can't explain it. And yet it's so obvious, you see. Those of you that have asthma, anybody had asthma here before in your life? Okay. You were given 2 kinds of inhalers if you had asthma. One inhaler is probably called Ventolin, and its job is to open up the airways, because what happens in asthma is you get a spasm of the muscles that surround the airways, so you get this narrowing of the tube through which air has to pass into the lungs, so you're wheezing and whistling and laboring your breathing. And the other inhaler you got would have been a steroid to suppress the inflammation, the swelling, and the inflammatory debris that clutters up the airway. So you get 2 inhalers. One is called a bronchodilator to dilate, open up the airway. The other is to suppress the inflammation. Now, what are these inhalers based on? The inhaler that opens up the airway is a copy of adrenaline. And the inhaler that opens up, that suppresses the inflammation is a copy of cortisol. Serve us. What are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones. Exactly. In other words, we're giving asthmatics stress hormones, the same stress hormones that are made by their own adrenal glands when they're stressed. All that's happened is that their own stress response mechanisms have been exhausted, and now we have to give them stress hormones from the outside. Now guess what? If you're rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, what will they give you? Cortisol, the stress hormone. Shouldn't we be asking ourselves that if we're treating people with stress hormones, whether or not there might be a connection between stress and their disease? Now, of course, why the children of parents who are stressed? Because the parents' stresses actually program the physiology of the child. Because you can't separate the individual from the environment. And this is true all our lives. A study of women in Australia, 500 women, 550 women, who had lumps in their breasts that were of sufficient concern as to require a biopsy. Now they had these biopsies, but before the results came back, they also had a psychological interview, or a questionnaire. It turns out after the results came back, that if a woman had had a significant stressful incident in her life, just prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself had 0 effect on whether or not that lump was cancerous. Similarly, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also had 0 effect. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and had a major stressor, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now the medical doctors running the study couldn't understand this one either, because they said, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? See? Because we don't understand the connection between individuals and the environment. Now here's the deal. If I were to act inappropriately towards you right now, if I were to stress you right now, physically or emotionally, you'd have 3 healthy options. If I were to stress you right now, what would happen is that stress wouldn't just be in your head, it would be in your whole body. You know, your heart rate would go up, your nervous system would be firing off all kinds of impulses, your adrenal glands would be pouring adrenaline and cortisol so that you could escape or fight back. These are the flight or fight hormones. And so your body would be in a different state physiologically in a split second in order to help you fight to escape. That's good. So in the short term, the stress hormones help you fight or to escape. But what do they do in the long term? In the long term, the stress hormones deplete your body, suppress your immune system, give you heart disease, high blood pressure, give you ulcers, thin your bones. Okay? Now, what would happen if you were stressed, something happened that was stressful to you, and you're sitting there all upset about it, and your body is in a state of imbalance and upset, but somebody that you trust came along and said, hey friend, I see that you're not feeling well, I see that you're upset, puts a hand on your shoulder and says, hey, do you want to talk about it? And what would happen to your body right away? Yes, it would relax. You'd take a deep breath. Your brain would get oxygen. You'd start thinking more clearly. Your heart rate would slow down. Your blood pressure diminish. The stress hormones abate in your system. And you go back into a healthy balance. All because somebody said, hey buddy, do you want to talk about it? Those women that had been stressed but were emotionally alone, the stress hormone acted on their system for months. That's why they were more likely to get cancer. It's really straightforward. In other words, again, the physiology of one individual can't be separated from the psychological and social environment. And finally, at the end of life, a study in a major medical journal a few years ago showed that amongst elderly couples, when one of them is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They get sick. In other words, the risk of illness goes up in the other one when the one is hospitalized. Why? Because their immune systems are not isolated from our psychological, emotional, social relationships. You can't separate the mind from the body, and you can't separate the individual from the environment. Just illustrated with a disease I'm quite interested in, because, again, medical science says we don't know the cause of it, and I think that it's only because we're not looking.
What if your addiction wasn't the real problem? What if it was your attempt to soothe a wound no one could see? In this powerful reflection, Dr. Gabor Maté reveals how trauma, especially in childhood, reshapes our behaviors, our beliefs, and our biology. This isn't about judgment. It's about compassion. Because behind every pattern is a pain. And behind that pain, a part of you still waiting to be seen.
So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice I has said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities. I said any behavior. Now, the official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, is that this is it's a primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. This is how they see it. And I say that's just not true. The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for? And although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, I don't see it as it's a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So let me perhaps show you why, if that's okay. A human being has two fundamental needs, apart from the physical needs, in infancy, in childhood. One is for attachment. Now, attachment is the closeness and proximity with another human being for the sake of being looked after, or for the sake of looking after the other. Now, human beings, as mammals, and even birds, are creatures of attachment. We have to connect and attach because otherwise we don't survive. If there's nobody that's motivated to take care of us, to attach to us that way, and we're not motivated to attach to others, we just can't survive. One interesting thing is that the endorphins, which are the body's internal opiate chemicals, which heroin and all the other opiates resemble, they help to facilitate attachment. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors so they don't have endorphin, opiate activity in their brain, they won't cry for help and separate from their mothers, which would mean that they would die in the wild. And which goes back to what happens early in childhood when there's stress and trauma, these endorphin systems don't develop. And then when people do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug to them. They feel love and connection for the first time. That's why it's so powerful. But so we have this need for attachment, without which obviously the young infant, who is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature of any creature in the universe at birth, cannot survive without the attachment. And that attachment relationship, given that we have the longest period of development of any creature, well into adolescence and beyond, attachment is not a negotiable need. But we have another need, which is authenticity. Now, authenticity, auto the self, means being connected to ourselves, just knowing what we feel and being able to act on it. So that means our gut feelings. So let's look at how human beings evolved. For hundreds of thousands of years, and for 100,000 years or so of this species existing on Earth, how did we live? We didn't live in cities and houses and so on. We lived out there in the wild until very recently in human existence. Now, just how long do you survive in the wild if you're not connected to your gut feelings? Not very long. If you start using your intellect instead of your gut feelings, you just don't survive. So that's a powerful survival need as well. So attachment is a survival need. Authenticity is a survival need. But what happens if your authenticity threatens your attachment relationships? For example, as a 2-year-old, you get angry because you didn't get that cookie before dinner. But your parents can't handle anger because they grew up in homes when there was rageaholism and they're terrified at the very expression of anger. So they give you the message that good little kids don't get angry. The message you receive is not that good little kids don't get angry, but that angry little kids don't get loved. Because your parents are now sullen, they won't look at you, they talk to you in a harsh way, you're not getting loved. Not experiencing love at that moment. No. But you gotta stay attached. Guess what you're gonna suppress? The authenticity every time. And this is how we lose connection to ourselves and to our gut feelings. So that, strangely enough, that very dynamic, which is essential for human survival in a natural setting, not becomes a threat to our survival in this more modern setting, where to stay authentic is to threaten attachment. And so we give up our authenticity, and then we wonder who the hell we are, and whose life is this, and who's experiencing all this, and this life doesn't, and who am I really? And so that's where the reconnection has to happen. That's where the healing happens, is with that reconnection. But it's because of that conflict, that tragic conflict in childhood between authenticity and attachment that most of us face, that we lose ourselves and lose connection to our gut feelings. Now, this leads to the question of trauma, because it's one thing to recognize that all this originates in childhood pain. It's quite another to transform that pain. And for that, we have to understand what trauma is. So people often think that trauma is what happens to you. So trauma is a divorce when you were small and your parents fighting. Trauma is your mother's depression. Trauma is your father's alcoholism. Trauma is your parents' argumentation. Trauma is physical or sexual abuse or some loss. Those aren't the traumas. Those are traumatic. But the trauma is not what happens to you. The trauma is what happens inside you. And as a result of these traumatic events, what happens inside you is you get disconnected from your emotions, and you're disconnected from your body, and you have difficulty being in the present moment, and you develop a negative view of your world, and a negative view of yourself, and a defensive view of other people. And these perspectives keep showing up in your life in the present. So in other words, the addiction is not the primary problem, it's an attempt to solve a problem. And then the real question is, how did the problem arise? In other words, this is where my theory is that it's always rooted in childhood trauma, and that the addiction is an attempt to deal with the effects of childhood trauma, which it does temporarily, while it creates even more problems in the long term. And so the issue is not just to recognize what happened 10, 15, 30, however many years ago, but to actually recognize their manifestations in the present moment and to transcend them And how do you do that? By reconnecting with yourself, by restoring the connection with your body primarily and with your emotions that you lost. And once you do, when you found these things again, then you have what we call recovery. Because what does it mean to recover something? It means to find it again. So what is it that people find when they recover? They find themselves. And the loss of self is the essence of trauma. So the real purpose of addiction treatment, mental health treatment, any kind of healing is reconnection.
What if your symptoms were never the enemy, but the message? The anxiety, the illness, the addiction, each one calling you back to yourself. You were never weak for breaking down. You were wise for surviving. Healing doesn't begin with doing more. It begins with remembering who you were before the world asked you to be someone else. Your body has been telling the truth all along, and now you're finally listening.